Welcome to the Tank Podcast. Today, we'll be listening back to a conversation hosted at the British Library as part of our book talk series between artist Victor Burgin and artist and writer Leslie Dick. They discuss the web-based version of Burgin's work, Afterlife, a series of full-screen images, most of which are digitally generated, and a brief text in which a scientist searches for his wife in a simulated afterlife. As they traverse the work's themes, Burgin and Dick discuss immaterial objects, the iceberg theory of writing, and the financialisation of the contemporary art world.
So the question we can begin with, perhaps, what are the propositions about our world and about artworks that this work makes? Is the digital space, by definition, a space of uncertainty and possibility, where memories, dreams, fragments of movies, and recollected paintings flow into and out of our lived experience?
Is that a question about what type of artwork it is?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, obeying the analytic injunction to say what first comes to mind, what comes to mind is relatively banal, but it's true. I think I'm back in the 60s again because this was the ambition of conceptual art, and it's at least one branch of conceptual art. In the late 60s was to, Lucy Lippard and her collaborator, whose name I forget, wrote their dematerialization of art. It was a time when artists didn't have studios. They worked in their office. I still do. There were dealers who didn't have galleries. And we were in flight from the commodity form, not because we had anything against having money. It's always very nice. But the dictature of the commodity form suddenly became an insupportable.
Yeah.
Insupportable?
Yes, insupportable.
Unsupportable. Is it unsupportable?
Unbearable.
Insupportable. It became too much of a restriction.
Yeah.
I mean, as a byline, I should say that we should distinguish between commodity and markets. The relation of the work to the commodity form, and the relation of the work to capitalism. So I think it's important to distinguish these two things, because there were commodities and markets long before capitalism. So what characterizes capitalism is not the existence of commodities and markets for commodities. It's rather the private ownership of the social means of production for putting profits into relatively few hands. So that's a different issue entirely. But as I say, that's a byline. Just to say that this wasn't a political tendency tending towards moralism, but it was rather I feel a genuine feeling that the place of the market in art was just too big, and it was just determining too much. And of course, now, if that was true in the 60s, it's true with knobs on now.
Yeah.
Since the deregulation of the financial markets and all that money that these people making money out of the money markets, they had all the yachts they could buy, all the islands they could buy. What can they do with their money? They put it into art. So they had to have somewhere to park their money. Art became a big parking lot for money. Yeah. And it's totally, for me, it's totally wiped out contemporary art.
Well, we were talking about materiality.
Yeah.
Do you really think that the digital image is immaterial? Because I don't.
It's a different kind of materiality. It's a different kind of object. Mm. One could very well argue that, an image on the internet has no materiality, and then somebody would say, yes, but then what about all those servers, What about all those fiber optic cables and undersea cables linking all of these server farms all over the world?
Expensive
and all of these things.
Yeah.
But that's not to say anything about the image. That's to say something about
its support.
The hardware that supports it. But the image itself is immaterial unless you're prepared to accept a different definition of materiality, a different definition of an object. And I think I was prepared for, the ground was prepared for me when I started to read, Simondon and various other people, Yuk Hui, who's, talking about the digital object. I think the ground was prepared for me having spent a great many years, as you did, reading psychoanalytic theory, because there you find that the psychical object, the psychical reality, is as real a reality as any other form of reality. It begins with Freud's abandonment of the seduction theory and the idea that a fantasy can have just as much impact, literally, on the body as a real event. So I was already half inclined to accept the notion, and this is entirely what Hui is trying to talk about, that there are objects without physical materiality. For me, this implies a whole new way of approaching art through so-called criticism, because Simondon, probably the clearest example of the automobile and the network of roads, the idea that the object is not just the material, but it's the associated milieu. So if you say, what's the associated milieu of art, and then you try to define the object in terms of that milieu, then you get into a situation in which the relation to the market, for example, as I just spoke, is not just an epiphenomenon. It's not just a supplement to the object. It's a characteristic of the object itself. So you define the object in terms of all of its dimensions, all of its aspects. And I find that this joins up with some work in contemporary theory of science and epistemology. There's a woman I'm interested in called, interested in the purely intellectual sense, called Anne-Françoise Schmidt. And she speaks of what she calls the contemporary object. It's an object at the intersection of a number of disciplines. It's an object which is itself composed of disciplines. It's the point at which, it's a bit like negative theology. She said it's an object X, and it's the space, it's the whole, if you like, where there's various disciplines try to achieve it, try to touch it and fail. And so these various disciplinary approaches grind to a halt at a certain point, and where they all grind to a halt at that point, that space there is the object. And I wonder what it might mean. This is an epistemology, philosophy of science. I wonder what it might mean if you took that idea into art criticism and approached the art object and considered it as composed of not just the substance, that you're describing it not as the critic in a phenomenological distance from the object of her or his observations. But what if you take into account all of the complex of determinations of that object and count those as integral parts of the object, and also your own projection into and on the object is also part of it. So Schmidt goes from object to what she calls a complex object, and then she goes next into an integrative object, which integrates the observer into that complex. And then this is what she calls a contemporary object. And at first I thought, why does she have to call it contemporary? And I thought, of course, because it's a temporal object, and it's only ever defined at that moment. And then the next time you define it, it's moved on, it's changed.
Because history has changed.
Yes, and circumstances and all the different determinants have changed.
Yeah,
I mean, she's doing all of that in science, but I think one could bring it, by analogy, to criticism and have a different kind of criticism. And God knows we need that.
I think it might be interesting when it's question time to think more about this question of immateriality. For me, I get excited about the image, and specifically the digital image, as a site of a kind of idealization. All of my thinking about art kind of emerges out of a kind of obsessive return to Lacan's essay on the mirror stage, which basically is suggesting that it would be maybe even easier or better to be an image than to be a human being. As a human being, I'm a three-dimensional object, and I have an interior as well as I have an inner surface as well as an outer surface, and I have parts of my body I can't even see, and obviously all sorts of things are coming in and out of me all the time, and there's this excess and inability to ever cohere or have a clear boundary. And what the image offers me is a two-dimensional space where not only do I have a boundary, but I am the figure against a ground thereby the important thing. And there's a very neat rectangle around me that frames me and sets me off so that the situation inside the image is, so to speak, under control. And I aspire to be like that. I would rather be like that than be the kind of excessive burping, et cetera, body that I actually am. And of course, part of what's at stake in this failing body or excessive body or embodied body is that it's going to die, right? There's all sorts of things at stake. I was born, I'm going to die, etc. And I think that for me, the image, the idealized image, in a sense, is double freighted. So even when we're looking at an entirely computer-generated image, there is a way in which its perfection proposes its opposite, what's left out, what isn't in that image. In a sense, we understand the image by thinking about what it's not. Therefore, the body that's going to die is always there in play within this interaction. I wondered if you wanted to say something. I'm kind of jumping around in my questions, but I wondered if you wanted to say anything about this question of the double freighting, that your texts and images are both have their power in part by what they present or show and what they do not present or show, which comes to mind as we encounter them. Do you want to say anything about that, about the iceberg?
Leslie's referring to an anecdote. I rarely get to talk about language because, if you're in the art world, people don't. Language is wall to wall, but it's kind of, disavowed for the most part. There's writing all over the art world, whereas when I first went to art school, artists went to art school, not me, but other artists went to art school because they didn't want to speak. It was abandoned language, all ye who enter here, was inscribed over the door of the art academy. And within the academy, it was the purely visual, you spoke through your images. So although I don't think anybody subscribes to that now, and I don't think there are any card-carrying Greenbergians left still alive, nevertheless, even though there's language, the art world is awash with language, there's more space given to explanatory texts on museum walls today than there is for the artworks, which kind of huddle in little spaces between the texts that tell you what you're supposed to think and where it came from and all of this. But nevertheless, it's not talked about. Nobody talks about language in work. And I think this results in, for me, is a lot of ill-considered use of language in art. But the anecdote comes from the fact that I did get to talk about that, or I got spoken to about language once. When it was on the occasion of an exhibition. I think the last time I showed in London, at Ambika in 2013, I think, a large show with a number of video works, and some friends came to the opening. One of them, a very well-known writer, biographer, and not somebody who dealt with the art world at all, normally. And she said to me, the way you write, it reminds me of Hemingway. And I was crushed because I was devastated. I'd never read Hemingway because his reputation as a macho man had preceded him. And I thought, no way I'm going to want to read any of this stuff. And the idea that somehow that my writing reminded her of Hemingway was totally devastating. But I thought, well, as she said that, I should find out what Hemingway actually writes like. And I started reading Hemingway, not so much the novels, but I read his, the memoirs of his A Movable Feast, his time in Paris, which is great. And I find that he produced what he called his iceberg theory of writing. He said he found that he could leave out so much. He said so long as he knew what he was leaving out, and so long as he knew that the reader knew it was left out, then you can get by with very little on the surface, as it were. And that appeals to me. And I think all of those concise forms of writing attract me. This is an expression of personal preference. But the writing here is very much along the line of iceberg writing, the haiku. They're not formally haikus. They're not 5-7-5 structures. but the idea that you can and should put the entire story into a very small space. Also, I had a short period of time, I remember very briefly, worked as a journalist, and I was a junior reporter on a North of England newspaper, and I remember being told, as a junior reporter, you put the entire story in the first paragraph because most readers are not going to read beyond that. And that was a great training. So you put everything in the first paragraph, and then kind of waffled after that because you knew nobody was going to read it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, this question of sort of the implied text. And I was very struck by you saying that for you, part of what you're interested in when you make a work like this is the mental image that I, as the viewer/reader, have experience, construct, that I make that mental image when I'm reading the text. I make another mental image when I'm looking at the image, your images. And that somehow there's this sort of third position that's produced, which is the reader's experience. And I just wanted to quote something you wrote in 1986 about being between. You wrote, "My decision to base my work in contemporary cultural theory rather than traditional aesthetics has resulted in work whose precise location is uncertain, between gallery and book, between visual art and theory, between image and narrative, work providing work between reader and text." And I think that this very simple idea that the work is actually going on between me and the text, me and the artwork, is very powerful, because for me what's really exciting is, as I encounter this work, Afterlife, I'm thinking about this lost love and the wish to put the two halves of the treasure map together again. And then the text is interrupted by an actual image of a photograph of a woman. And this is not the woman I was looking for. And in a sense, she produces a whole other set of questions and ideas. So I was very interested in this, not just the iceberg, which is a sort of implied set of meanings, but also the production through mental images, having sets of expectations that are then disrupted and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that? The between space, which in certain Japanese contexts is called ma, which I always think is hilarious,
yes,
because ma is like, we all know who ma is, right?
I mean, two things here. I think of, again, actually, I find myself reading philosophy of science more than anything else these days, because those guys seem to be, onto something. But there's a woman called Isabel Stanger. She's a very politicized scientist, and she speaks of the interstice. She doesn't use the word between. But she says that, given the world, given the situation we're in, that what she's interested in is not opposing the bloc, not a form of politics that opposes the bloc, because then you say you define yourself in terms of the bloc, but it's rather to hollow out an interstice, to find interstices within the situation you're actually in, within which to work. And that general, rather abstract picture that could be applied to a number of situations, I was reminded of Stanger when I was trying to think about how I could possibly do something on the internet, because the internet was an irredeemably noisy place. And the world we're in is a noisy place, and we're reminded of it this evening. So there's this continual noise. How do you find an interstice in which to put a work that depends upon silence, spaces, and so on? So I worked with a web programmer, not a web designer, but a web programmer. And I said, look, this is what I want to happen. I want to be able to enter this empty space. So when you when you click on the link, you're taken to the first page, and the first page simply tells you to use the arrow keys to navigate through it. So when you touch the first arrow key, you then enter just a white space. It's very 60s, actually. It's like this 60s 10. You know all those movies in the 60s where everything was white and people wore white suits and walked around white spaces. So, the very first move you make, and it's interactive in the most minimal sense. It's interactive like turning the pages of a book, really. So you hit the key, and voila, you go into this space, and then you can keep moving through these empty spaces, these texts and images. Do you want to find the goal?
Yeah, I would argue that the experience of interacting with this work is an experience of interstices. You're between the images and the text, and you're composing a whole emotional landscape. It might be time for other people to have some say.
Okay, that works. I'm really interested in the fact that you have this feature that makes it full screen, which seems to me to be speaking to this dilemma with the digital image, which is that so often there's these constant other images that are appearing beside it. So often you'd have like adverts flashing next to images, or tabs open as well. And I'm just curious how that sort of dilemma of the image online has been part of your thinking.
It never occurred to me I could possibly make a work on the internet because of that problem. It's very difficult to have anything that's not going to be invaded by ads, by various kinds of solicitations, menu bars, hot links, all of those. So as I say, I found a friendly web programmer, and we worked together. I told him what I wanted to happen. I said, I don't want any buttons on there. I want only the arrow keys to work. And is that possible? And very often, these are things he'd never done. Nobody had ever asked him to do this. To the contrary, it's rather people ask him to put more activity, more links, more solicitations on the screen. So this is rather a process of gradually, as we work together, gradually clearing the table, gradually clearing the space, getting rid of everything. And I was actually surprised to find that it was possible to do this. And the other thing about it, of course, is that, in a sense, it's potentially interminable. You can't see them here because of the light conditions. This is a Hammershoy, because there are occasionally, as Leslie said, sometimes the text begins, there is a story in which, and then I tell my memory of a story, but I encapsulate the entire, you've got Golding's Pincher Martin is told in, this one, because it's a story about an island, there's one text. So there are references to texts, which are standalone stories just on one page, but which are also at the same time take the reader, if they know the reference, to that other place, and the other detail, the iceberg. Equally, there are images like this one, where there's a Hammershoy show in Paris at the moment. I first saw his work at the Royal Academy here in London many years ago, and was very impressed by it. So I set out to make my own, digital version of a Hammershoy. And again, that is a kind of iceberg thing. It stands alone. It is what it is. It takes you elsewhere. So the work, what comes to mind by association is the image of a stream and tangled bits of vegetation floating down it, which pick up other bits as they flow and then lose bits. So it's changing all the time, but there's a kind of core of stuff floating down the stream. Analogously, this work is a kind of core of stuff that sticks together, but as it flows down the temporal stream as a temporal object, it picks up other bits, which are the associations and so on of the reader.
What you were saying a bit about the kind of follows on a little bit from what you were saying about the imperfection and things that are outside the image. There's a kind of temptation to think with computer-generated imagery that you can achieve anything, that everything is possible. But even with a kind of brief glance through, I think the kind of landscapes, you can kind of achieve a higher degree of kind of photorealism. Whereas when you kind of see some of the interior spaces, there's kind of there's slightly more uncanny kind of quality to them, where they don't seem so real. And I wonder whether that has kind of influenced the kind of images you've chosen to make. And I think even when you think about the history of photography, and kind of with each technological advance, you're kind of able to do different things and capture different kinds of images. Not sure what the question is, but
Yeah, I mean, obviously, coming from a background in photography to using virtual cameras, and by virtual camera, I mean quite simply a physical camera modeled in computer space. You can move a camera. Sometimes they have little camera icons, you can drag around the screen. And they're simulations, they're models of actual cameras, in that they behave exactly as a camera would behave. And a great deal of the standard, the gold standard, the ultimate level of achievement that computer modeling is aiming for, and the entire industry, especially Hollywood, is aiming for, is what they call photorealism. And to achieve photorealism, there are dudes eating pizza, through the night, coding imperfections into virtual lenses. So as you know, glass lenses are never perfect. So you have something called spherical aberration, which will affect more or less any glass lens, because you can't grind a glass lens so that it's perfectly sharp from edge to edge. And if you get them that are near sharp, they're very expensive. So the simulated lens is optically, mathematically perfect. But that wouldn't look photorealistic. So they code imperfections into the virtual lens to make the image appear more photorealistic. So the standard in digital imaging today, they're not trying to reproduce what the world looks like, they're trying to reproduce what the world looks like in a photograph. That's one thing. Another kind of related anecdote is when I first came to computer modeling, way back, I spent a lot of time working with, I was in this Wagner piece, and I wanted these rolling waves, German Romanticism. And it was back in the days before the game engines were doing everything in real time. And I had to send off my file to a render farm and have people render it. And then it would come back and I would see what I got. And I was looking at it, and it looked okay, but there was something odd. And I saw that the way the waves were breaking was very strange. They were tearing rather than breaking. And I thought, oh. And then I thought, well, in that world, that's the way water behaves. It's not this world. It's a different world. And then a trio of related anecdotes. 75% of the time I spend modeling, I spend on forums trying to get answers to technical questions, because you're continually hitting problems. And so you go on a forum, and there are these guys, probably most of them about 9 or 10 years old, and and you ask their advice, and you have all of these. And there must be a name for this, but when people leave things on forums, they'll have a favorite saying at the bottom, or a line from somebody at the bottom. And I remember there's one which said, hey dude, go outside, the graphics are amazing. And I remember I was once, when I came to this early, I was placing a tree in my landscape, and I was looking at the tree. I thought, oh, this is terrible. Trees don't look like this. And then I went outside, looked at a tree, and I thought, they do look like that. I stopped looking at trees. When I was photographing trees, I wasn't looking at trees anymore. Once you start computer modeling them, you start looking again. And I'd never had that experience since I first went to art school. Sitting my entrance exam at the Royal College of Art way back then. It was a 3-day exam, 2 days of which were spent in the life room drawing a naked lady. And I spent years drawing naked ladies, but it really gets you to look.
That's why they're naked.
That's why they're naked.
Cora has a question. No?
Now it's on. Hi. I was wondering if you could go back to Leslie's point about the emotional dimension of the work. Because am I right in thinking that at the center of this piece is desire for another person? Did I get that right?
Or maybe I didn't get it right. We'll find out.
Well, I was
Victor.
wondering if you could just say a bit more about your decision to place the body, and particularly the female body, at the center of the work.
Duh. I guess because it's the center of my life. And I try in my work to represent the real, which is to say, my experience of being in the world, which includes the appearance of trees, and it also includes affective relations to other people. And not a few of those people have been women. So that, as a heterosexual man, the relationship to the woman has, in a way, it's a kind of a continual note, it's a leitmotif, it's a backbeat to everything that I've ever done. Quite simply, because it's quite simply there. And for it not to be there would be to ignore it. Whereas my reality includes it. It's part of the constitution of that reality. It's an element in that reality. You also have scenes of war in here. I experienced scenes of war only as a very small child and wasn't very much aware of them, growing up in an industrial city that was having the hell bombed out of it. But that constant presence of war, anticipating a war to come, being aware you've just missed a war, being aware that other people are suffering the consequences of a war, is part of my reality, even though I'm very comfortable here, you know? I'm not in Syria, thank God. But nevertheless, I think some trace of that mark on my world, on my psychical sphere, as it were, the bubble I'm in the middle of, is kind of inscribed with these various facts. So all of those facts, I try to get in there in some way or another. It was thinking now by association of the French semioticien and literary theorist Roland Barthes. In his inaugural lecture at the Collège de France, he said, what do writers do? What have writers been doing always? He said, I'll put it crudely. He said, they try to represent the real, which of course is impossible. And that's why we have a history of literature. You know, they all try to represent the real, their way of their being in the world, which they didn't choose. The fact of their being in the world, they try to represent it. And of course you can't. You fail. Lacan is the theorist of this. He's behind Barthes' remarks that the real is unrepresentable. It's that which stands outside representation. So you try to represent the real, you fail, and that failure drives you to make the next work. This is what I've said to, when I was teaching students. I'd say, yeah, of course you're not happy with it. If you were happy with it, you probably wouldn't make anything else. It's that desire to try to get it right the next time that keeps you going. And Barthes projects that into the history of literature and said, we have a history of literature, and we'll probably have a history of art because of that continual attempt to represent something you can't represent. That, for me, is it's the only thing I'm interested in. I mean, it's not the only thing I'm interested in. I'm interested in having a drink after this, but it's what I do. It's what makes me want to be an artist. It's what keeps me doing things which, half the time, when I finish, oh shit, But I try to represent the real. So the woman's body, my own body, other bodies, destroyed bodies, suffering bodies, aging bodies, the entropic body, as Leslie was talking, are part of my real. And I try to inscribe all of that in there. But I think that What keeps everything moving is always desire. Lacan calls the endless metonymy of desire. So you're trying to represent the real, you fail, you try again, fail better, as Beckett said. But what pushes you to keep going is the endless metonymy.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is taken from Waiting Games by Kate Simcoe and the London Electronic Orchestra.